You already know it's a Pyrite Town Punks production.
Hello everyone, my name is Nico Yossi and today I am introducing my favorite format in all of competitive Pokemon to you, Orre Colosseum. Orre Colosseum started around 1.5 years ago when a few of us were coming here, inspired by VGC and wanting to play our favorite way of playing Pokemon, VGC, in Generation 3, which is our favorite generation. Today I want to give a broad overview of the format Orre Colosseum, and I assume that you already know a few things about competitive Pokemon, and best case you come here from VGC, which is where most of our players come from most of the time. So as I said, the format started 1.5 years ago and it keeps seeing continuous meta development. There's still a lot to explore. And I want to do this to get more people to join our format. I love it, and I'm sure if you try it out after this introduction, if you're interested and you try it out, I'm sure you will understand why I love it so much. So let's get into it. So first up, what is Orre? So Orre Colosseum, also known as Orre, that's the short version of the name. Most of the time we just refer to it as Orre. It's also referred to as Gen 3 VGC because that just very obviously states what it is. It's just much easier to tell people who don't know about it yet what it is by just calling it Gen 3 VGC. And Orre Colosseum, or some people also call it Orre Cup, because that's our regular one-day tournament that we hold. And we got another one of those coming up in 3 days, Orre Cup 12. So this is also why I'm doing this. I want to get people to join the tournament. In any case, Orre Colosseum is based on the post-game challenge from Pokemon XD mainly, which basically has you play VGC in-game against the computer, which is a really fun and really hard challenge. I'm sure anyone who has tried to beat it knows that it's actually pretty tough and requires some pretty good knowledge of the game. And Orre Colosseum is different from ADV Doubles OU. So ADV Doubles OU is the other Gen 3 doubles format. They're kind of like sister formats, that's how I like to see them. And many of our players also play in ADV DOU. However, Doubles OU is different because they play with very different rules. They do 6 versus 6, they don't have item clause, etc. So if you want to play Gen 3 doubles with a VGC method, then you should come to us, Orre Colosseum. That's what we're all about. We're all about playing VGC in Generation 3. That's what started all this, the desire to play VGC in Generation 3. And therefore we also have largely the same rules as VGC. However, there are slight differences to VGC. First up, we play at level 100. And that is because in Generation 3, you cannot level down your Pokemon. So if you play at level 50, you actually cannot use Tyranitar and Dragonite. And you also cannot use very important moves, such as Crunch on Raikou, Hydro Pump on Suicune, and some others on legendary Pokemon. And also Hydro Pump on Vaporeon, if that matters to you. So that's why we play at level 100. It just gives us all the options. And all in all, it doesn't make a huge difference. And then we also have certain clauses like Sleep Clause, because that is actually in the in-game Orre Colosseum. And Sleep Clause was also a rule at tournaments back in the day. So yeah, this format is based on the XD post-game challenge Orre Colosseum, but at the same time we do try to... we get inspired by tournaments from back in the day, which happened mostly in Japan. However, you also had Journey Across America in the US, And I'm not sure, but I think I've heard there were even some tournaments in Europe. In any case, most of the tournaments happened in Japan, and they were VGC-style tournaments with bring 6, pick 4, item clause, and all that. But our main inspiration is Orre Colosseum from Pokémon XD, and that's also why our format is called Orre Colosseum. So what makes Orre Colosseum so special, and why do I love it so much? Well, first of all, me personally, I've got great nostalgia for Generation 3. I'm sure many people understand why. Many people grew up with Generation 3. It is one of the coolest generations in Pokemon. Pokemon Emerald is one of the best games, arguably the best game ever in the Pokemon franchise. So what exactly is it that makes Gen 3 doubles so special compared to other generations, and in particular Gen 3 VGC compared to other generations of VGC? Well, as I said before, VGC didn't actually take place in Generation 3 yet, at least not the worldwide circuit that we have today. It was really a regional circuit in Japan, and that's pretty much it. So that's why we wanted to add this format to basically fill that gap of Gen 3 VGC previously not really existing. Gen 3 VGC has, or Orre Colosseum, has a few key mechanics that are very, very different. If you know anything about early generations of Pokemon, you know that there's no physical special split yet. That was introduced in Generation 4. In Generation 3, your attacks are special attacks or physical attacks depending on the typing. And you can read more about that somewhere else. You can just Google physical special split to learn more about it. But basically, every typing that has an evolution nowadays and the dragon typing, those were all special types. So every move of those types, such as Fire Punch, Ice Punch, Dragon Claw, Crunch, those were all special attacks. They used your special attack. So for example, Alakazam and Gengar like running Ice Punch because that is a special attack in Gen 3 and they can fire Ice Punches off their huge special attack. And that means that every other type was physical. So ground, normal, fighting, bug, steel, ghost also. Famously, Shadow Ball was a physical move in Gen 3. That means Snorlax, Metagross sometimes, as well as other Pokemon often run Shadow Ball. A very interesting part of this is that hidden power could be either physical or special. And I think this is something that is very special, very unique about these early generations, and something that I really like about Gen 3 VGC is that hidden power is a move that both physical and special attackers can make use of and can abuse the fact that they can fill in any coverage they need with hidden power. So for example, physical attackers will very commonly run hidden power Ghost, such as Tauros, in order to be able to hit Gengar, while special attackers such as Zapdos or other electric types will often run hidden power Ice or hidden power Grass to hit those ground types that are otherwise immune to their electric type attacks. So that's the first big difference of Gen 3 doubles compared to other generation doubles. Of course, so Gen 3 doubles is the only generation of doubles that didn't have the physical special split yet. And then the other big difference is that in Generation 3 doubles, you have the immediate switch in. What that means is that when your Pokemon faints during a turn, you have to immediately switch in a replacement. So for example, you have a fast Pokemon such as Alakazam take out a Gengar, and the partner Metagross from Alakazam then also targets that Gengar slot with Metagross. That means Gengar goes down and then a Mon from the back comes in and has to take the Meteor Mash from Metagross. This makes it possible that Gen 3 VGC games can end in one turn, because you can finish off the 2 first mons with an earthquake or explosion, and then finish off the mons in the back that come in immediately with another earthquake or explosion. That's something totally unique about Orre Colosseum, the possibility of one-turn games. And that's something that is very, very different, and means that there are many different ways in which you can abuse this mechanic. For example, you can status a Pokemon on the switch in. So for example, you take a kill and then you Thunder Wave the Pokemon that comes in, which cannot protect from that, and basically is, just fodder for whatever gets thrown at it the turn when it comes in during the turn. And that also means you can get a knockout that you otherwise maybe couldn't get. For example, if your Pokemon takes out the opponent and then Metagross comes in from the back, and then your Marowak follows that up in the same slot with a Bone Meringue or Earthquake, that means Metagross goes down without being able to protect or take out the Marowak first, because it comes in during the turn. So yeah, there are many different ways to abuse the immediate switch in, and it makes for a very unique identity of Gen 3 doubles and Orre Colosseum in particular. Especially because in Orre Colosseum you know what your opponent has in the back, or what they can have in the back, so you can make very calculated plays covering for any potential switch-ins that could come in and have to eat your attack on the way in. Then there are some other differences to modern VGC. Very important one is that there's no dynamic speed. As you might know, dynamic speed was introduced with Sword and Shield in Generation 8. Being able to change the speed order during the turn was something that was not possible until Generation 7. And so that includes Generation 3. So in Orre Colosseum, you cannot slow down the opposing Latios with an Icy Wind and then have your Metagross outspeed it during the same turn. You will have to wait for the next turn to be able to outspeed. Another very big thing about Orre Colosseum is that there are very few speed control options. Key pieces of modern VGC, such as Trick Room and Tailwind, did not exist before Generation 4. So that means you can never revert the speed order. So what is fast will always be fast. What is slow will always be slow. You cannot set up Trick Room to change that. And you cannot set up Tailwind to have your whole team be faster. That means that base speed is so much more crucial. So it's so much more important for a Pokemon to have a high base speed, to be able to outspeed Pokemon off the bat, and basically always be able to outspeed if you, for example, keep it in the back and bring it in the end game. So something like Starmie really shines because it outspeeds those important threats like Latios and Latias with its 115 base speed stat. And then something like Snorlax will pretty much always be the slowest mon on the field because there is no Trick Room. That doesn't stop Snorlax from being very, very viable. So the speed control options that you do have in Orre Colosseum are Thunder Wave, most importantly. Then there's Icy Wind. Technically, there's also Scary Face. And I think that's about it. You could also mention String Shot, but there aren't really any viable mons that learn String Shot. Another very big part of Orre Colosseum are the very strong critical hits. So I think this was introduced in Gen 6, where critical hits only do 1.5 times damage. So starting from Gen 6, I think. But before that, including Generation 3, critical hits actually did 200% damage, so 2 times the damage that they would usually do, that those hits would usually do. That means, for example, a Hydro Pump into a Metagross, which is a neutral move, on a critical hit is basically like a super effective move into that. So most often will pick up that KO. And also critical hits back then in Generation 3 had actually a higher chance than nowadays. So it's a 1/16th chance, 6.25% in Generation 3. Which means, of course, they are still rare, but they do come up sometimes. And of course, because they are so strong, they often can win or lose you the game. So yeah, strong critical hits is something you definitely have to look out for. And then the other key difference to modern VGC is that status works a bit differently. A lot of status conditions are quite different. And for example, first up, there's sleep, which actually can last up to 5 turns in Generation 3. That means sleep is even more broken in Generation 3 than in modern VGC, where it can only last 1 to 3 turns. In Generation 3, in Orre Colosseum, it can last 1 to 5 turns. So it's not unheard of that a Pokemon will just stay asleep for like 3, 4, or even 5 turns. And that really shuts you down so hard. And I'm sure when you see this, you understand why we play with Sleep Claws. Burn also is a bit different. So Burn still halves your attack stat, just like nowadays. But it also does more chip damage. It actually does 1/8 chip damage, or 12.5% every turn. So that's quite massive. That's actually quite a lot of chip damage to do every single turn. Much more than the 1/16th in modern VGC. And then finally, maybe the biggest difference when it comes to status conditions is paralysis. Paralysis in Generation 3, and I think up to Gen 5, or maybe Gen 6 even. I think maybe up to Gen 6. Back in the day, paralysis dropped your speed by 75%. So effectively, your speed was only 1/4 of what it originally was after you got paralyzed. This means that paralysis, so not only do you have that 25% chance to just get fully paralyzed and not be able to attack during that turn, but also your speed gets dropped so hard that basically everything becomes faster than your Pokemon. So even something as slow as Snorlax needs only minimal speed investment, maybe 12 speed EVs, to outspeed, for example, a Jolteon or Aerodactyl once they're paralyzed. So that's why I like to refer to teams with T-Wave spam and Choice Band Snorlax as Gen 3 Trick Room, because it basically reverts the speed order if you paralyze your opponent, no matter how fast they are. At least for that particular Pokemon. So that's it for the differences to other gens. There are still differences with the type interactions, because as you might know, there's no Fairy type in Generation 3. There was no Fairy type up to Generation 5, so that includes Orre Colosseum. And without a Fairy type, Dragon types are so much more threatening. Not only does Dragon become a much better defensive typing because it only has that weakness to Ice and Dragon, Dragon also becomes a much better offensive type, because the only type in Gen 3 that resists Dragon is Steel. So as long as you're not hitting into a Steel type, you can always do good damage with a Dragon Claw from something like a Latios or a Latias. Even though the Fairy type didn't exist, Steel type was arguably still the best typing in the game. In Orre Colosseum, that is also true because Steel resists Explosion, and Explosion is one of the biggest, it is the strongest attack in the game, the most important attack in the game. So Steel being one of the types that resisted is huge. And Steel also just having so many resistances, in particular also having a resistance to Dark and to Ghost in Generation 3, makes it even better than nowadays. Well, I guess nowadays it has a resistance to Fairy, so I guess it evens out. But yeah, Steel was a superb defensive typing, as it still is. And finally, because there's no Fairy type, the Poison type is actually pretty worthless in Generation 3. Unfortunately, Poison is weak to Psychic, which is a very common attacking type, and also weak to Ground. And Earthquake is the second strongest attack in the game after Explosion and Self-Destruct, which I will just refer to as Boom from here on out. So yeah, Boom and EQ are the strongest attacks in the meta. They are the most important attacks to be able to play around. And Poison being weak to that is just basically a death sentence, because also Poison doesn't do anything offensively. It can only hit Grass type super effectively because there's no Fairy type. So yeah, you're very rarely gonna see Poison types other than Gengar or maybe the occasional Crobat in this format. Finally, there are some other minor differences. For example, Electric types are not immune to paralysis in Generation 3. It means you can paralyze Zapdos, you can paralyze Raikou, and you can paralyze Jolteon, which doesn't even absorb Thunder Wave with its Volt Absorb in Generation 3, which is really sad, but that's the case for Jolteon. Then, Grass types are not immune to Powder moves, so you can Sleep Powder into Sceptile or Venusaur, for example. You can Spore them, you can use all of these Powder moves onto Grass types. It doesn't matter that they are Grass types. And a little one at the end, Ice types are not immune to Sheer Cold. This doesn't really come up much, but I just wanted to mention it. You can Sheer Cold an Ice type. You can actually kill them with Sheer Cold. That means Sheer Cold is the best one-hit KO move, because no Pokemon is safe from it. And yeah, you can use one-hit KO moves in this format, of course, because we are basically playing like VGC in Orre Colosseum. Next up, let's talk about the moves in Orre Colosseum. Overall, in Generation 3, there is a lower power level with the moves, because a lot of strong moves were introduced in Gens 4 and later, such as Draco Meteor, Close Combat, Flare Blitz, Wave Crash. A lot of these moves did not exist in Generation 3, so overall the moves that you can use are much weaker. For example, Latios and Latias, the strongest Dragon type attack that they have is Dragon Claw, so they're pretty much never picking up a one-hit KO on almost anything with Dragon Claw. But they still run it because, as I said, Dragon type is just such an amazing offensive type. However, there are some moves that are stronger in Generation 3 than Gens 6 and later, because in Generation 6, some attacks had their base power lowered. For example, Overheat in Generation 3 has 140 base power. Overheat is actually the strongest special attack in the game, just judging from base power. So Moltres' Overheat, I think, is safe to say the strongest special attack in the game. Well, I don't know. Maybe Pikachu has a word to say. Hydro Pump and Fire Blast and Thunder and Blizzard, I think those are all have 120 base power, unlike the 110 base power as they have later on. So they are a bit stronger and they do some massive damage. Ice Beam, Thunderbolt, and Flamethrower have 95 base power instead of 90. So they do just a bit more damage, but that can definitely matter. And then Hidden Power, as I said, very important move in this format. Hidden Power had a base power of up to 70. Technically it was 30 to 70, so it mattered depending on the EV, depending on your IVs. Made a difference how strong the Hidden Power was. But of course, you always want to run Hidden Power at max strength, and that means it has 70 base power, which isn't very strong, but at least it's stronger than 60. Other than that, the key difference with moves in Generation 3 doubles, with spread moves, is that they function totally differently to later gens. So from Gens 4 and up, it has basically remained the same. But in Gen 3 it was very different because, of course, this was their first time introducing double battles in Generation 3. So they did some wacky stuff, which really shapes the metagame quite a lot. First up, spread moves that only target your opponent. That includes Surf, because Surf only targeted the opponent in Generation 3 and not your partner. But also Rock Slide, Heat Wave, Razor Leaf, I guess, Blizzard, Icy Wind. All of these moves only do 50% of the actual damage they would do in a single battle. So when you target 2 opponents, they only do half of the damage. And moves that target the whole field, and that in Generation 3 that only includes Earthquake, Magnitude, Explosion and Self-Destruct, so EQ and Boom, they have no damage reduction in Generation 3, so they do full damage. This is a huge difference to Gens 4 and up. Earthquake in Generation 3 doubles is so strong because it hits every opponent with 100 base power, unlike 75, which is a massive difference. For Explosion, it might not matter that much that it does 100% instead of 75%. However, when it comes to something like Choice Band Metagross or Choice Band Snorlax being able to one-hit KO even max HP Metagross, this definitely matters here, that Boom actually does 100% damage, even as spread damage. So as I already said, and as you might notice by now, Boom and Earthquake are 2 meta-defining moves, really the 2 most important moves in the metagame. And as a little end note for spread damage mechanics, in Generation 3 only, Light Screen and Reflect will actually cut the damage in half if you only have 1 Mon remaining on your side of the field. So at first, if you have 2 Mons remaining or more, so if you have 2 Mons on your side, they act just like in every other generation. Screens will cut the damage by 1/3, just like in modern VGC. But in Generation 3, if all of your Mons have fainted except for 1, if you only have 1 Mon remaining and you have Light Screen or Reflect up, they will actually act the same as in single battles, which means they will cut the damage in half, which can be pretty huge sometimes, and at least makes up a little bit for the fact that you don't have Light Clay. So at least that's a little buff there for screens in Generation 3. One big part of the metagame is Protect, of course. If you know anything about double battles and VGC, you know that Protect is key, and even more so in Orre Colosseum. As I said, Explosion and Self-Destruct are the strongest move in the metagame, and having Protect to play around it is so important. A lot of games will come down to being able to call an Explosion, or at least not play too carelessly in front of it. You have to have the option to Protect in front of Explosion to not lose immediately sometimes. And this includes Endure, but Endure is much less common than Protect. So the big thing about Protect and Endure in Generation 3 is that they have a 50% chance on the second try. So double Protect being a 50% chance, meaning that it is just as likely to succeed as it is to fail, unlike nowadays where it's much more likely to fail, makes for a more volatile game, because even if your opponent already protected and now you think, okay, now is the time to explode on them, they still have a coin flip of a chance to still protect and be safe from that explosion. So that still makes an explosion on a second protect quite scary. Then for the rest of this moves section, one other point, some of the moves are less reliable. For example, Will-O-Wisp is less accurate. It only has 75% accuracy up to Gen 5. Disable only has 55% accuracy, so it's actually very unreliable in Generation 3, unfortunately. So Disable is a move that you basically never see, just because even hitting the Disable is almost a coin flip. And then there are some other moves that are extremely strong in Generation 3 because they were not nerfed yet. Thunder Wave, for example, had a 100% accuracy, unlike the 90% it is nowadays. That means you're pretty much always going to hit your Thunder Wave. And not only that, but of course Paralysis also being stronger means overall Thunder Wave was so much stronger in Generation 3. And then also Swagger was more accurate. It had a 90% accuracy instead of the 85 of nowadays. And Swagger is also a move that you will very commonly see. For example, Latias is a Pokemon that very commonly runs Thunder Wave and Swagger in combination to totally shut down your opponent. Other than that, some important moves such as Taunt. Unfortunately, so Taunt is a very important move in modern VGC, but Taunt very rarely gets used in our format because it only lasts 2 turns in Generation 3. This is very unfortunate because it's a nice option for shutting down certain status moves. But yeah, unfortunately it is what it is. It only lasts for 2 turns. So really only 1 turn after you used it. That's why Taunt is quite bad in Orre Colosseum. However, Encore is very good in this format. Nowadays Encore lasts 3 turns, but in Generation 3 Encore could last anywhere from 2 to 6 turns. So most of the time Encore would last more than 3 turns and really shut down your opponent for quite a while. That means that Alakazam is actually a very strong Pokemon in this format because it is the best Pokemon that has Encore and it outspeeds almost everything. Then sound moves did not ignore Substitute in Generation 3, so if you hit the opponent with, well, let me think, what sound moves even existed? Sing, Hyper Voice, I guess, which was only on Explode. But yeah, sound moves did not ignore Substitute. They actually got blocked by Substitute, or Substitute took the damage from those sound moves. However, that does not include Perish Song and Roar. So you can still Perish Song if your opponent set up a Substitute, and you can still roar them out. And finally, one of the most important physical attacks in the format, because Metagross is just so important, is Meteor Mash. And Meteor Mash was quite a bit stronger in Generation 3. It had a base power of 100. However, it was also less accurate at 85% accuracy, instead of nowadays where it has 90 base power and 90% accuracy. Also, yeah, Taunt is less important nowadays because there was no Trick Room. Is less important than nowadays because in Generation 3 you didn't have Trick Room or Spore. Well, you have Spore, but it doesn't really get used. If anything, it gets used on Breloom, but Breloom is super niche. You don't have a meta mon like Amoonguss, which is on a lot of teams and wants to spam Spore. So all in all, Taunt is not as important, but it's also just much worse. Alright, so up to the next section. Let's talk about the items. Something that people, after 5 minutes of thinking about Generation 3 doubles, or no, Generation 3 VGC in particular, or any format with item clause, something that many people realize is, wait a second, in Gen 3 they had so few actually viable items. A lot of our most common items nowadays, such as Life Orb, Focus Sash, etc., Choice Specs, Choice Scarf, were only introduced in Gen 4 or later. In Generation 3 you have much fewer very good items. But we still play with item clause, and me personally, I really like this fact. I think it makes for some very creative team building, and it really pushes your creativity to the limit. But yeah, so that also contributes to an overall lower power level in Generation 3, because you cannot just slap Life Orb on a Pokemon and do more damage. The only items you have to increase your damage output, the only offensive items you can use are Choice Band, which did already exist in Gen 3, so Choice Band is the exception of the choice items. So you do have Choice Band, which is of course one of the best items. And then you have type boosters, which are also different in Gen 3 because type boosters only boosted your moves by 10%. However, they are still relevant and they still get used because a difference of 10% still basically is the same as a difference of having a positive nature. So for example, a timid Zapdos with Magnet still commonly 2-hit KOs most Metagross because it basically hits as hard as a modest Zapdos. So Magnet Zapdos is actually a very common set that people run in this format. And so this applies for all the type boosters. And all the type boosters pretty much can have some use, but Magnet is probably the most common one. And for defensive options, there are way fewer also in Gen 3. You have way less viable defensive items. The only really good defensive item is Leftovers, which works the same as nowadays. So that means relatively speaking, it's an amazing item in Gen 3. In Gen 3 you did not have Focus Sash, Assault Vest or Light Clay. So all in all, your only options for and also Citrus Berry and the pinch berries like Ayapapa Berry and others give much less of an HP recovery. So Citrus actually only heals an exact amount of 30 HP points, which means Citrus is pretty much useless at level 100. It can be used at level 50, but it's still not as strong as in later generations. And then something like Ayapapa Berry, which nowadays heals 1/3 of your HP, in Generation 3 only heals 1/8. So much weaker. Still, because there are so few viable items, you can definitely use Ayapapa Berry. However, you should never use it over Leftovers because 2 turns of Leftovers recovery are already equivalent to recovering HP from an Ayapapa Berry, which is quite funny. But yeah, if you already have Leftovers on one of your Pokemon, you can just put Ayapapa Berry on another one if you need that recovery in a pinch. Also, they do activate at 50% at least. So you don't have to drop to 25%, you actually already get that recovery at 50%, which at least that's somewhat makes up for their weaker recovery. But yeah, other than that, defensive items, besides Leftovers and Ayapapa Berry and those other berries, you also can use Bright Powder, which nowadays is really a very niche and really more like a fun item that you just use like for fun. But in Orre Colosseum, Bright Powder is quite relevant. It comes up quite a lot, and that 10% chance to just dodge your opponent's moves can really be huge, especially on frail Pokemon such as Gengar. And also, a lot of Pokemon, for example, are threatened by moves such as Meteor Mash and Hydro Pump, which are already pretty unreliable in and of themselves, and then Bright Powder can just make them even more unreliable. So something like Gengar with Bright Powder, for example, is safer into Metagross with Meteor Mash, which usually one-hit KOs, but it has to hit the move first. Then there's Shell Bell, which unfortunately is bugged on Showdown, but hopefully we're gonna have that fixed soon. And once it is fixed, I think Shell Bell will actually be a very good item because it does heal off of every target hit. So if you have something like Swampert, which has a strong Earthquake, and you hit both of your opponents, or even if you also hit your partner, you recover off of that. So you can recover some pretty big HP off of Shell Bell. So on the right Pokemon like Swampert, Shell Bell could be absolutely huge, and I'm hoping to see the proper Shell Bell mechanic implemented soon. Other than that, you have some items like Salac Berry, Pataya Berry, which get used to either boost your speed or boost your special attack in a pinch. Then you have White Herb, which is also a very good item for physical attackers that don't want to run Choice Band because it prevents Intimidate at least one time. And for example, on something like Gengar and Electrode, Pokemon that want to boom on the opponent, they don't want their firepower reduced because they really need all the power they can get. So White Herb really helps them to preserve their power. But then White Herb also helps Pokemon like Arcanine that want to use Overheat twice in a row, for example. And then, for example, Cherry Berry is actually a very viable item in Orre Colosseum because Paralysis, as I said, is so strong that you often don't only want to have Lumberry but also Cherry Berry on your team. You want to have 2 items that make you immune to Paralysis for at least 1 turn. So yeah, all the other items are generally not viable. I would not recommend to use something like King's Rock or Scope Lens because they don't really matter much. They don't really get their activation. They only have like 10%, or for Scope Lens you get a 12.5% chance to crit with a normal move. However, there's one more item. Also, there's Persimberry, which is great because Swagger is great, so you can activate a +2 boost with Persimberry without getting confused. So Persimberry is also a pretty good item. And finally, a last one that I should mention here is Quick Claw. Quick Claw is actually pretty good because it has a chance of 20% to activate. And it, of course, completely ignores your speed and just lets you move before the opponent. So it is very strong on a Pokemon such as Snorlax, for example, which can go for a Quick Claw self-destruct and just defeat the opponent when you were already in a losing position. It can bring you back. So that's it for the items. Overall, much fewer options. However, because you have such few very viable items, it really pushes your creativity to your limits. It really rewards very good team building to choose the proper 6 items for your team. And I really like that about Orre Colosseum. I do like this limitation pushing you. I think that's an important part of the format, and for me it's a really endearing part of the format to still use item clause. Next, let's talk about weather. So in Generation 3, weather did not have as many options as later on. First up, let's talk about sand. Sand teams exist. I actually won our last big tournament, Orre Cup 10, with a sand team. And no, I did not have anything crazy like Excadrill on the team. And I did not use Sand Veil, which is the only ability that gets any benefit from sand. I basically just used the team as a team with 3 sand immune mons in Tyranitar, Swampert, and Metagross. All of them very bulky, and I'm just spamming Protect, and I just want to accumulate chip with that team. So basically that's really the only way you're really going to use sand, unless, or you just have a Tyranitar on your team and it just happens to set up the sand. But really, sand is not really a team that you can build around unless you really go in on the chip damage. And that's really the only benefit you get, because rock types do not get a special defense boost in Generation 3. That was only introduced in Generation 4. However, Tyranitar is still a bulky mon, so it still works. And also, because there's no Life Orb or Choice Specs, I think all in all it kind of evens out. So yeah, the abilities for sand are Sand Veil, which does exist in Gen 3, but it is only on very mediocre Pokemon like Cacturne, Sandslash, Dugtrio. And Dugtrio really wants to use Arena Trap if it is used. And there's Sandstream, the only weather setting ability in the standard Orre Colosseum format, set up with Tyranitar, which can set up the sand. And next up, let's talk about Rain. Rain is probably the strongest type of weather team style. Rain sweepers can definitely get very scary. You have Ludicolo, which is a great mon because it can fake out and let your partner set up the rain. And you do have Hydro Pumps, which get very strong in the rain. However, Hydro Pump is also unreliable, and you don't really have many better options. You can use Waterfall, which is a special attack because it's a water type in Generation 3. But it's just not strong enough to get those one-hit KOs that Hydro Pump can get. You don't have a strong Surf because Surf is 50% reduced spread damage in Generation 3. You don't have a strong Muddy Water or anything. You really have to rely on Hydro Pumps. And relying on Hydro Pumps really gets scary in the long run, which is why Rain teams are rather scarce. In general, we don't really use Weather all that much. But if anything, Rain teams are definitely overall the strongest Weather teams. But one part that holds them back is also that Latios and Latias are key Pokemon in this format. And because they resist water, and because they might not even get 2-hit KO'd by Ice Beams, they are kind of roadblocks for Rain teams, and they threaten Kingdra hard with Dragon Claw. So sometimes it's hard for Rain teams to really deal with those Latis. Rain does have the most weather abilities in Generation 3, because not only is there Swift Swim to double your speed, which is a great ability for Gen 3 standards, but also there's Rain Dish, which doesn't really get used, but it does exist on Ludicolo, so it can give Ludicolo some recovery in the rain. And then there's Drizzle, but that's only on Kyogre, so unless you're playing a specific format which includes restricted legendaries, such as Journey Across America, you will not see Drizzle in the format, in the battle. Next up we got Sun. Sun is rather niche, but Sun can be very scary to go up against. Sun is really the scariest type of weather team to go up against, because you're in for a tough one when you don't have proper explosion resistances, for example, because Sun teams usually use Executor and Shiftry, and both of these mons, what they want to do is they want to get the Sun up and then outspeed the opponent and just explode on them. And they have a pretty high attack stat, so they are able to take out pretty much anything that doesn't resist their explosion. However, Sun is still pretty niche, because unfortunately Solar Beam is not a good attack in the metagame. Grass type just offensively doesn't really threaten much besides Starmie and Swampert. But the biggest threats in the format just outright resist Grass type, and that's Metagross, Latios, Latias, and Zapdos. And then the other big threat is Snorlax, which of course also doesn't take too much from a Solar Beam. And the other boost, the other advantage of Sun, the boost to Fire type attacks, doesn't really matter that much. Fire types don't need the boost really, they are fine with just the normal firepower that they have with Overheat, for example, which is a very strong move, which doesn't need the Sun boost most of the time. For Sun abilities you have Chlorophyll, so that's the equivalent to Swift Swim, but for Sun, so it doubles your speed. Most importantly on Executor and Shiftry. And then there's Drought on Groudon, but once again, Groudon only in restricted formats. And finally, the last weather is Hail. And I'm gonna make this quick because Hail is a very sad case in Generation 3. Unfortunately, Hail really doesn't get anything in Generation 3. The only thing you do get is that chip damage on anything that is not an Ice type. But you're never gonna use it because you cannot set this up with an ability like Sandstorm. You have to set it up manually, and that is never going to be worth it. You don't even get the accuracy boost on Blizzard, so if you're trying to hit Blizzards in the Hail, you're still gonna have a tough time. That was an introduction in Generation 4. In Gen 3, you still have Blizzard at 70% accuracy in the Hail. The only actual ability that gets affected by Hail is Forecast. I used to say that there is no ability for Hail, but it's not true. I guess Cast Form actually does change its shape in the Hail, and that's all you get out of Hail. So don't use Hail. Another important thing to mention about weather is that there are no items like Damp Rock or the others which will boost the weather to last 8 turns instead of 5. So Sun and Rain are forced, they only last for 5 turns, so you have to really make it work in those 5 turns. This is also part of why weather teams are not as good in Generation 3. So it's very easy to stall out those 5 turns with protects. And then finally, weather set by abilities in Generation 3 is permanent. So this really only affects Tyranitar for our standard format. Sandstorms set up by Tyranitar will last an eternity unless you change the weather with Rain Dance or Sunny Day. On to the next point. Let's talk about abilities in Orre Colosseum. So in Generation 3 there are fewer abilities in general, but also every single individual Mon has fewer options in terms of abilities because there were no hidden abilities. So every Pokemon can only have 1 or 2 different abilities. Also, certain very important abilities such as Prankster, Defiant, and other ones did not exist yet. So the really viable abilities are very limited. You've got Intimidate, which is definitely the best ability. You've got Levitate, which is a great ability. You've got Clear Body, Thick Fat. Abilities like that are definitely very good. You've got Lightning Rod. However, Lightning Rod works a bit different in Gen 3. It does not grant an immunity to Electric, and it also does not raise your special attack. But one could still argue that Lightning Rod in Generation 3 is actually better than later, even though you don't get a special attack boost or immunity. Because if we're realistically, the only Pokemon most of the time that uses Lightning Rod is Marowak, so that doesn't care about the immunity or special attack boost. And in Generation 3, Lightning Rod does not redirect your partner's move. So you can have your Zapdos next to a Marowak and still go for Thunderbolts into the opponent. So that is a very big part of Lightning Rod in Generation 3, and a big part of why it is actually one of the greatest abilities in Orre Colosseum. Other than that, Volt Absorb, as I mentioned before, does not absorb Thunder Wave, unfortunately, so Jolteon can only switch into Thunderbolts, but not into Thunder Waves. Sturdy does not act as a Focus Sash at full health. Sturdy only protects you from one-hit KO moves, but also it makes you immune to them, so that's kind of nice, I guess. But yeah, Sturdy doesn't come up much. And then Oblivious, Inner Focus, and Own Tempo. Nowadays, they make you immune to Intimidate, but that was not the case in Generation 3. They do not matter much at all. The only one that really matters is Inner Focus, because it makes you unable to be flinched. So something like Alakazam, for example, really likes the fact that it cannot get flinched by Fake Out. Other than that, an important part of Generation 3 that you have to be aware of is that gaining an ability does not activate it. What do I mean by that? I mean, for example, certain strategies, such as skill swapping your Intimidate with your Stantler, for example. So Stantler using skill swap on the opponent to swap away its Intimidate will not make the Intimidate activate again. Intimidate will only activate when you switch in with a Mon that naturally has the ability, like Arcanine. You can never activate it by skill swapping it or tracing it. And the final point on abilities is that Gengar has Levitate. You should be aware of this. You cannot Earthquake a Gengar. So this is really important. And Gengar really should have kept Levitate forever. Because look at Gengar, look at my boy nowadays. What a sad case. I mean, I guess you can still use it, but not having Levitate is so sad for Gengar nowadays. But it has it in Generation 3, so all you Gengar fanboys, be happy about that. So come to play Orre Colosseum if you want to use Gengar, because it's actually quite good. But yeah, if you skill swap Levitate, for example, of course you get those effects. You cannot activate something that only activates once in the game, like Intimidate on Switch In, for example. For my final big point of explaining the Orre Colosseum format, let's talk about some Orre Quirks. So I've talked a lot about Generation 3 doubles in general, so all of this basically applies to, most of this, what I said, applies to also to ADV doubles OU, or Gen 3 doubles in general, or Gen 3 in general. I gave you an overview of those different mechanics. Now let's talk about some very key pieces of Orre Colosseum, some quirks of the format, certain things that really define the identity of Orre Colosseum. First up, let's talk about a big one. In Orre Colosseum, you can actually see your opponent's HP stat. What does that mean? This is based on Pokemon XT player versus player battles. So we are basically assuming that we're playing on XT. So even if we're playing on Showdown, we want it to be the same way as if we would play on XT, and we connect our Game Boy Advance and we play against each other on Pokemon XT. And on Pokemon XT, when you play against each other, you see each other's HP stats. So basically, you can immediately tell what the opponent's HP investment is. For example, if you see a Metagross, most commonly it will either have 301 HP, which means it has no HP investment, and you immediately know that. You don't have to find out by playing against it. Or it will have, for example, 364 HP, which would mean it has max HP. And once again, you immediately see that. So you can immediately adjust your strategy according to that. But you only see that if they get switched in, of course. So you don't see that in team preview. You only see that when the Pokemon appears in-game. So this is totally unique in competitive Pokemon. I don't know of any other format that uses this mechanic. And I think that is really cool about Orre Colosseum, because it really gives you more control. It really rewards knowledge and skillful plays and making a proper strategy around the opponent, around what investment they have, whether they're bulky or not. And I have never heard anyone complain about this. It makes for something very unique and interesting, and I love this part about Orre Colosseum. And also, if you're thinking, well, maybe I don't want my opponent to know what HP investment my Charizard has, well, honestly, I don't think it really hinders the more niche Pokemon too much. I think really this is something that balances the best of the Pokemon, because really it is pretty great to know whether the Metagross is bulky or not, to know whether Latias is max HP or not. It really balances the best Pokemon above all else, in my opinion, because those are the Pokemon that you might have different game plans against, whether they're bulky or not. Because Metagross can definitely be bulky, because some people, like me, really love bulky Metagross, but then others actually run jolly Metagross with no HP investment, because they just want to be able to outspeed the opponent's Metagross. So yeah, this is something that really balances the best Pokemon, in my opinion. Really hurts the best Pokemon more than anyone else, and really, who can complain about that? Also, for example, knowing Snorlax's HP investment can also be really important. I mean, just imagine in modern VGC, imagine you start the game, both of your leads enter the game, and your opponent leads with Flutter Mane, and you can immediately see the HP stat of Flutter Mane. So you can immediately see, oh, do they have some HP investment, or do they not have any HP investment at all? Is this just a fast Flutter Mane, or is this a bulky Flutter Mane? And I think that would actually balance Flutter Mane even more. I mean, not like it's balanced, I don't know why I said even more, but like this could balance Flutter Mane a little bit at least. Would make it easier. You wouldn't have to find out how bulky the Flutter Mane is by playing against it. You would still not know the defense investment, but you would at least know if they actually invested in bulk or not. And this makes me think about one other important point. This introduces another mind game, because you can actually abuse the fact of the opponent thinking that you don't have bulk because you don't have HP investment. You can abuse that by putting some hidden defensive investment in either defense or special defense. So for example, if you otherwise would only invest in HP, maybe you would invest a little bit in HP. In Orre Colosseum, you can trick your opponent into thinking you don't have any investment by simply not investing in HP, but investing in defense or special defense instead, and catching them by surprise like that. Because of course it is only the HP stat that you can see. You don't see any of the other stats. But yeah, I think it's a very interesting part of Orre Colosseum. Besides that, one other part of Orre Colosseum that is unlike VGC is that our high stakes match, such as Top Cut in a tournament in our Orre Cups, the Top Cut, we play those matches in best of 5. And some people might get turned off by that. They might think, why, best of 3 is already enough. I don't want to have those matches go on for too long. And I can understand that first impression. However, I think you should understand that our format is a very volatile format. I've talked about how important explosion is, and that double protects can have 50%, have a 50% success rate. And add into that the fact that since we don't have as much speed control, the base speed matters much more, and there are much more speed ties, especially between some of the strongest Pokemon in the format, like Latios, Latias, Gengar, and Tauros. For example, those all commonly, most of the time they're all run at max speed, and they're all gonna speed tie, so it's always a 50-50 of who moves first, and sometimes this can really win or lose you the game, whether you get that coin flip or not in your favor. This means that a lot of the time a game can come down to a 50-50 chance. For example, can I get this double protect when I know they're going to explode? Can I win this speed tie that would win me the game or lose me the game? All in all, this means that a best of 3 just doesn't give you enough room to make mistakes and to lose those coin flips. So in a best of 3 you can get punished by a coin flip, and we just don't want that. We want there to be more chances to win the game with good play and not have to lose to a coin flip, and this is why we play our most important matches as best of 5s. Now this means that if we do an Orre Cup and we do a one-day tournament, the Swiss rounds are still best of 3 because we don't want it to take too long, but then the really important matches in Top Cut are going to be best of 5. And I mean, winning a best of 5 is just an amazing feeling. I think it's great, really rewarding to be able to win a best of 5. So as much as like it can take longer than a best of 3, it's an important part of the metagame, and it really helps to keep the metagame kind of stable and healthy, in my opinion. And then finally, as I already mentioned at the beginning, we do have sleep clause in this format, and yeah, this is a big difference to modern VGC. So if you're like me and you like running Hypnosis Persian, just be aware that if you put one Pokemon to sleep, you should not try to put another one to sleep. Even I forget that sometimes. I think we all forget that from time to time. But yeah, you can only put one mon to sleep at a time. So yeah, this is another part of Orre Colosseum. And for the final slide of this presentation and the final point of this presentation, let's get into what does the metagame actually look like. So let's have a little look at the state of the current metagame. Our last tournament that we had was Mount Battle 3. This was a weekly tournament, so every week we did one match, which was best of 5. We had 24 participants, which were split into 4 pools, and then the 2 best players in each of those pools went into top 8, into playoffs. And what you see here are the usage rates of the most used Pokemon in playoffs. The top 12 Pokemon in playoffs. All in all, we used 14 different teams in playoff. We also, in a match, in a best of 3 or a best of 5, we do not swap teams. We do it just like in VGC. We have to use the same team for the whole match. So yeah. As I mentioned before, Metagross is a very important Pokemon in this format, and it is the most used Pokemon. Well, actually, so this is interesting, right? Because there are Latios and Latias, but they function very similarly. So if you add Latias and Latios in this statistic, you can actually see that added up, they end up at 100%. Unless maybe there was a team that used both of them. But all in all, either Latios or Latias is actually the most common Mon in the format if you count them both as one Pokemon. But other than that, Metagross is the most common one. Then we have Snorlax. So Metagross and Snorlax, premier physical attackers of the format. They both have a boom, which is super strong. They have the strongest booms in the format. Then our premier special attackers are Zapdos, which handles Metagross very nicely. And then Latios. And Latias is really the premier support Pokemon, while also being able to throw strong special attacks at the opponent. And we got a fast special attacker in Starmie, which crucially outspeeds Latios and Latias and Gengar and Tauros. So it can always get a hit off before them, because yeah, you cannot set up Tailwind or something like that. And we got Tauros, which is the strongest Choice Band user in the format, which can get a one-hit KO on Latios, which is something very rare. Swampert is a very strong Pokemon in the format, has a good Metagross matchup, very strong Earthquakes, and just a great typing. Arcanine is after Tauros, it's the second best Intimidate Pokemon, and it is the best Pokemon at just handling physical threats, because it also threatens a one-hit KO on Metagross, which does not care about Intimidate because of its great Clear Body ability. Then we got Marowak, which is the best Lightning Rod Pokemon in the format and just an amazing Pokemon in its own right. But Lightning Rod is also an amazing ability for shutting down opposing electric types such as Zapdos and Raikou. We got Gengar, which some of you may think it's a little bit low on the list, and it definitely has amazing qualities in being Earthquake and Explosion immune. However, Gengar is threatened by the Latis and Starmie and Tauros, and it is quite frail. So unless you're investing a lot into its bulk, it's gonna die to one hit. But it does threaten its own explosion, and it can do a lot of different things. It is a very versatile Pokemon. And then finally we got Raikou, which is a strong Pokemon, and just like Starmie, it outspeeds the 110s and can throw off big Thunderbolts and set up Calm Minds, and a very strong Pokemon in its own right. Tyranitar is also good in the format, but it's just not in the top 12 from Mount Battle 3 playoffs. Not quite as good as these Pokemon. But yeah, this was it for my presentation about Orre Colosseum, my introduction to my favorite format. I hope I could introduce this format properly and make some of you more curious about it. If you want to get into the format, one huge opportunity to really get a good idea of it is to just join our next Orre Cup, Orre Cup 12, which is going to take place in 3 days on Saturday at 6 p.m. GMT. So I'm gonna also link that in the description of the YouTube video. I did share a link before in the Twitch chat, so you can find that if you scroll up a little bit. There's a Google Doc that I linked with all the information for Orre Cup 12. So if you like playing VGC and you want to try out Orre Colosseum, Gen 3 VGC, you should definitely join the tournament. If you don't want to play yourself but you want to spectate, you can also watch my stream on Saturday. If you just want to get into our community and learn more, you can join the Discord by clicking on the Metagross on my Twitch page. And that's about it. If you have any questions, you can ask them now. But this was it for the presentation, and I thank you all for your attention. And I hope I'm gonna see many more players enter our format and help our metagame flourish. Because we are still in the early stages. We have definitely come a long way since the beginning of the format. We have come a long way because at the beginning it was just 3 of us battling each other, and now we have lots of people joining our tournaments and lots of metagame development, and there's a lot of fun tournaments happening. We have even done a draft league already, and we're gonna do another one soon. And it doesn't stop being fun. There's still so much more to explore. We really have only gotten started. So this is the best time to get into the format and help us grow even more. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing you in our Discord. What is my favorite Pokemon to use in Orre? Oh, that's a good question. Man, that's a tough one. I mean, I love a lot of Pokemon. I'm gonna give shoutouts to Regice. I think Regice is underestimated by a lot of different people. I think Regice is a really fun Pokemon to use because it's just such an amazing special wall, especially in Gen 3. Regice definitely profits from no physical special split, because this means that most special attacks cannot hit it super effectively. The only one that can is fire type attacks. So when you use Regice and your opponent only has, for example, Zapdos, Latios, and Starmie left, then Regice might even be able to 1v3 that rest of your opponent's team if it has leftovers, for example. It does so much damage with its stab Ice Beam. It has a strong stab Icy Wind to lower the speed and support your team. And it has that Bolt Beam coverage, so it can also hit Starmie, for example, really hard with T-Bolt. The problem with Regice is, of course, it has a very rough time against the king of the format, Metagross. Of course, most often it gets one-hit KO'd by that Meteor Mash. It doesn't even need to be choice banned. So that's rough for Regice. It also has a bad Snorlax matchup. But all in all, when you get it in the right position, it can really win you the game, even if it's the only Mon left on your field against 2 or 3 opponents. And you can remedy that bad Metagross matchup by partnering it with an Arcanine partner, for example. So Arcanine can support Regice by lowering the opponent's attack stats, so making Regice more physically bulky, and also by threatening Metagross. So Metagross is not as safe to just stand in front of Regice when you have your Arcanine staring it down. Regice Arcanine is definitely a really nice lead that I like to use, and yeah, Regice is definitely one of my underrated favorites, I would say. I think it's a very underrated Pokemon and has a very nice place in the metagame that nothing else really can replicate. So yeah, if there are no more questions left, Snorlax at home. Yeah, well, I mean, if you can't lower the damage unless you set up a light screen. You can't intimidate a Regice. It's a special attacking Snorlax, yeah, basically. That is what it is. Yeah, I don't know. I really like Regice. I guess in many cases, in many ways, it is outclassed by Snorlax, but also, I don't know. I feel like Regice can win against special attackers much more easily, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just a little bit biased because I don't like Snorlax as much as Regice. But yeah, that was it for today's presentation, the introduction to Orre Colosseum. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you all learned something if you didn't know much about it yet. I hope I made some more people curious to try it out. In any case, yeah, thank you all for watching. Thank you all for watching very much. I hope you liked this presentation, and I hope I'll see you in the Orre Colosseum Discord and at Orre Cup 12.